On the night of February 15, 1898, the USS Maine sat peacefully in Havana Harbor. 266 American sailors were below deck, most of them sleeping. At exactly 9:40 p.m., a massive explosion ripped through the forward section of the ship. Within minutes, the Maine was at the bottom of the harbor, and those 266 men were dead. The cause? Unknown. But to the American public, whipped into a frenzy by sensational newspaper headlines, the culprit was crystal clear. Spain, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became the rallying cry that would drag two nations into a war that lasted just 113 days, but would reshape the entire world order. This is the story of the Spanish-American War of 1898, a conflict that transformed the United States from a regional power into a global empire, a war that destroyed the last remnants of Spain's once mighty colonial domain, and a war that produced one of America's most legendary presidents. But more than that, this is a story about how quickly everything can change. How a single incident, a mysterious explosion, can alter the course of history. Today, we're going to walk through every major battle of this war, from the stunning 7-hour naval victory at Manila Bay to the brutal uphill charge at San Juan Hill that made Teddy Roosevelt a household name. We'll examine the weapons, the tactics, the decisions made in the heat of battle, and the human cost of America's first true imperial adventure. Let's begin. To understand how the United States ended up at war with Spain in 1898, we need to go back 3 decades to an island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba. Cuba had been Spain's crown jewel in the Americas for nearly 4 centuries. But by the 1860s, the Cuban people, particularly the educated elite and the enslaved population, had grown tired of Spanish colonial rule. They wanted independence, they wanted freedom, and they were willing to fight for it. The first major attempt came in 1868 with what became known as the 10 Years' War. A wealthy plantation owner named Carlos Manuel de Cespedes freed his slaves and called for Cuban independence on October 10, 1868. This sparked a brutal decade-long conflict that ultimately failed, but demonstrated that the Cuban desire for freedom wasn't going away. After a brief pause, fighting resumed in 1879 with the Guerra Chiquita, the Little War, which also ended in Spanish victory. But with each failed uprising, the revolutionary sentiment grew stronger. The man who would become the soul of Cuban independence was José Martí, a poet, philosopher, and political organizer. Martí spent years in exile in the United States, where in 1892 he founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party. He wrote, spoke, and organized tirelessly, understanding that Cuban independence would require not just military force, but a unified political vision. On April 11, 1895, Martí returned to Cuba to join the latest uprising. Just over a month later, on May 19th, he was killed in a skirmish at Dos Rios. He was just 42 years old. But his death transformed him into a martyr, a symbol of Cuban resistance that would inspire fighters for years to come. The Spanish response to the 1895 uprising was severe. General Arsenio Martínez Campos initially tried a more moderate approach, but when that failed, he was replaced by General Valeriano Weyler in 1896. Weyler implemented a policy called reconcentration, concentration. Here's how it worked. Spanish forces would force rural civilians into fortified towns and camps, supposedly to separate them from the rebel fighters. The theory was that if the rebels couldn't get support from the civilian population, they would wither and die. In practice, reconcentration was a humanitarian catastrophe. Between 200,000 and 400,000 Cuban civilians died in these camps from starvation, disease, and exposure. Families were torn from their farms, packed into overcrowded facilities with minimal food, water, or medical care. It was one of the first examples of what we would later call concentration camps. American newspapers seized on these atrocities. But here's the thing. They didn't just report the facts. They exaggerated them, sensationalized them, and in many cases, simply made things up. This was the era of yellow journalism, and the two titans of American media were locked in a circulation war. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. These papers didn't just want to inform the public, they wanted to sell newspapers. And nothing sold papers like outrage, fear, and calls for war. The Journal and the World published lurid illustrations of Spanish atrocities, many of them completely fabricated. Headlines screamed, "Spanish cannibalism," "Inhuman torture," "Blood on the roadsides." They portrayed Spanish officials as monsters and Cuban rebels as noble freedom fighters. One famous, possibly apocryphal story involves Hearst and the artist Frederick Remington. Hearst sent Remington to Cuba to illustrate the conflict. Remington supposedly telegraphed back, "Everything is quiet. There is no trouble. There will be no war." "I wish to return," Hearst allegedly replied. "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Whether that exchange actually happened, it perfectly captured the spirit of the era. The newspapers weren't just reporting events, they were shaping them. But it wasn't just about selling papers. There were genuine American economic interests at stake. American businesses had invested over $50 million in Cuban sugar plantations. Trade between the U.S. and Cuba totaled around $100 million annually. And many Americans believed in the principle of the Monroe Doctrine, that European colonial powers shouldn't be allowed to brutally suppress independence movements in the Western Hemisphere. President William McKinley didn't want war. He was a veteran of the Civil War. He'd seen combat firsthand, and he understood the cost. Throughout 1897, he tried diplomacy. He pressured Spain to grant Cuba greater autonomy, to end the reconcentration policy, to negotiate with the rebels. Spain actually agreed to many of McKinley's demands. In late 1897, a new liberal government in Madrid recalled General Weyler, ended reconcentration, and offered Cuba a form of home rule. But the Cuban rebels, smelling victory, refused to negotiate. And events were about to spiral beyond anyone's control. In January 1898, riots broke out in Havana. Spanish loyalists attacked the offices of pro-autonomy newspapers. The American consul in Havana, Fitzhugh Lee, sent worried cables to Washington about the safety of American citizens in the city. McKinley made a decision. He would send a warship to Havana, ostensibly for a friendly visit, but really as a show of force and a means to evacuate Americans if necessary. The ship chosen was the USS Maine, a second-class battleship displacing 6,682 tons, commanded by Captain Charles Dwight Sigsbee. The Maine arrived in Havana Harbor on January 25, 1898. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. The crew conducted routine drills, officers attended diplomatic functions, and tensions slowly eased. Then came the night of February 15th. At 9:40 p.m., most of the crew was below deck. Captain Sigsbee was in his cabin, writing a letter to his wife. Suddenly, the ship shook with a massive explosion in the forward section. Accounts describe actually 2 explosions. A smaller one followed almost immediately by a much larger detonation, likely the ship's forward magazines going up. The Maine sank in just minutes. The bow section was completely destroyed. Of the 355 officers and men aboard, 266 died, most of them instantly in the initial explosion or trapped below deck as the ship went down. Only 89 survived. Captain Sigsbee, one of the survivors, sent a telegram to Washington that ended with a prescient warning. Public opinion should be suspended until further report. But public opinion was not suspended. The next morning, Hearst's journal hit the streets with a headline that took up the entire front page. The warship Maine was split in 2 by an enemy's secret infernal machine. They had no evidence. The investigation hadn't even begun. But the narrative was set. Spain had destroyed an American warship, and Spain must pay. The slogan appeared everywhere, "Remember the Maine." To hell with Spain. A U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry convened in March 1898. Their conclusion: the Maine had been destroyed by an external mine. A Spanish investigation, naturally, concluded the explosion was internal, possibly a coal bunker fire that spread to the magazines. Modern investigations, using more advanced techniques, suggest the Spanish were probably right. The most likely cause was spontaneous combustion in the coal bunkers, a known hazard on ships of that era. But in 1898, with newspapers screaming for vengeance and the public demanding action, the truth didn't matter. McKinley tried to hold the line. He knew war with Spain would be relatively easy to win militarily, but he worried about the precedent, about turning the United States into an imperial power. Spain, desperate to avoid war, agreed to almost every American demand. An armistice with the rebels, an end to reconcentration, even eventual Cuban independence. But McKinley faced a political nightmare. With midterm elections coming and his own re-election just 2 years away, 89% of the American public, according to polls at the time, supported war. His own party was turning against him. Congress was ready to declare war with or without his approval. On April 11, 1898, McKinley sent a message to Congress. On April 20th, Congress passed a joint resolution demanding Spanish withdrawal from Cuba and authorizing the president to use military force. Crucially, the resolution included the Teller Amendment, promising that the United States would not annex Cuba. On April 21st, the U.S. Navy began a blockade of Cuba. On April 24th, Spain declared war on the United States. On April 25th, Congress declared war on Spain, backdating it to April 21st. The war had begun. Before we dive into the battles themselves, let's understand what each side was bringing to the fight. The United States had been modernizing its Navy throughout the 1890s. By 1898, the U.S. Navy boasted 5 first-class battleships, 16 cruisers, and 6 monitors. These were modern, steel-hulled, steam-powered warships equipped with rifled breech-loading cannons, far superior to the older smoothbore muzzle-loaders. But here's the catch: the U.S. Army was tiny. At the outbreak of war, the regular army numbered only about 28,000 men, most of them scattered across frontier posts in the West. The United States hadn't fought a major war since 1865, and the army was completely unprepared for a tropical campaign. Spain, by contrast, had an empire to defend across 3 continents. Their fleet was divided between the Caribbean and the Philippines, and much of it was outdated. Spanish ships were often old, poorly maintained, and outgunned. More critically, Spain faced a fundamental strategic problem. They were trying to defend possessions thousands of miles from home against an enemy that could bring its full force to bear locally. The American strategy was straightforward: use naval superiority to blockade Spanish forces, prevent reinforcement from Spain, and systematically capture Spanish colonial possessions. The Spanish strategy was simply to hold on as long as possible and hope that American resolve would crack or that European powers might intervene. Neither happened. Our story begins not in the Caribbean, but 8,000 miles away in Manila Bay, Philippines. Assistant Theodore Roosevelt, serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had been planning for war before it even started. On February 25, 1898, 10 days after the Maine explosion and 2 months before the actual declaration of war, Roosevelt sent a cable to Commodore George Dewey, commanding the U.S. Asiatic Squadron in Hong Kong. Order the squadron to Hong Kong. Keep full of coal. In the event of declaration of war with Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic coast, and then offensive operations in the Philippine Islands. Dewey was a 60-year-old naval officer with over 40 years of experience, a veteran of the Civil War, who had served under Admiral Farragut at the Battle of New Orleans. He was methodical, calm under pressure, and supremely confident in his ships and men. When war was declared, Dewey's squadron was ready. It consisted of 6 warships, his flagship, the protected cruiser USS Olympia, along with the USS Baltimore, USS Raleigh, USS Boston, USS Concord, and USS Petrel. He also had 2 supply ships, the Nanchen and Zafiro, purchased and loaded with coal from British merchants who were happy to help for the right price. The Spanish force in Manila, commanded by Admiral Patricio Montoyo y Pasaran, was in terrible shape. Montoyo had 7 vessels, but most were old, wooden-hulled ships that would splinter like kindling under modern gunfire. His newest ship, the Reina Cristina, was outdated by at least a decade. He had insufficient ammunition, untrained crews, and he knew, absolutely knew, that his fleet would be destroyed. Montoyo made a fateful decision. Instead of defending Manila's heavily fortified harbor entrance, he moved his fleet to Cavite, 7 miles south, in shallower water. His reasoning? When his ships were destroyed, at least his men could swim to shore. On April 27th, Dewey's squadron departed Hong Kong. At midnight on April 30th, they approached Manila Bay. The entrance was guarded by 3 fortified islands, El Fraile, Caballo, and Corregidor, armed with coastal batteries. There were also reports of mines in the channel. Dewey decided to run the gauntlet in darkness. The Olympia led the way, lights out, engines at slow speed to minimize noise. As they passed El Fraile, a Spanish lookout spotted them and raised the alarm. Coastal guns opened fire, but in the darkness, every shot missed. The squadron slipped through without a single hit. At 5:15 a.m. on May 1, 1898, as the tropical sun rose over Manila Bay, Dewey's lookout spotted the Spanish fleet anchored in a crescent formation off Cavite. The Spanish ships were silhouetted against the land, making them easy targets. At 5:40 a.m., the Spanish shore batteries at Cavite opened fire. Their shells fell short, kicking up waterspouts harmlessly in front of the American line. Commodore Dewey turned to the captain of the Olympia, Charles V. Gridley, and spoke words that would echo through American naval history. "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." At 5:41 a.m., the Olympia's 8-inch forward guns roared to life. Dewey's battle plan was elegant in simplicity. The American squadron would steam back and forth in front of the Spanish line at 5,000 yards range, each pass bringing them slightly closer. The ships moved at 5 knots, close enough together to concentrate fire, but spread enough to avoid a single lucky hit causing multiple casualties. The Spanish returned fire immediately, but they were hopelessly outranged. Their shells fell into the water or sailed overhead. The few hits they scored barely dented the American ship's armor. The American guns, meanwhile, were devastatingly effective. The 8-inch and 5-inch rifles aboard the American cruisers fired armor-piercing shells that punched through wooden hulls like paper. Within minutes, Spanish ships were on fire. The Reina Cristina, Montoyo's flagship, tried to close the distance for a torpedo attack. It was a brave but futile gesture. American shells tore through her hull, started fires, and killed men by the dozens. Her steering was shot away. Fires raged out of control. Admiral Montoyo was wounded. At 7:35 a.m., after 2 hours of continuous bombardment, Dewey received a report that the Olympia was running low on ammunition. This turned out to be incorrect. Someone had misread the gauges, but Dewey didn't know that. He ordered the squadron to withdraw to count ammunition and let the men have breakfast. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of a battle, with enemy ships burning in front of them, the American crews sat down to eat breakfast. The Spanish, watching from their burning vessels, must have thought it was some kind of psychological warfare. In fact, it was just supreme confidence. The Americans knew they were winning. They knew the Spanish couldn't hurt them. They could afford to take a break. At 11:16 a.m., With ammunition confirmed to be plentiful, Dewey ordered the squadron back into action. This time they closed to just 2,000 yards, point-blank range for naval artillery. The slaughter intensified. The Reina Cristina, already crippled, took more hits and was beached to prevent her from sinking in deep water. The Castilla, a wooden cruiser, was burning from stem to stern. The Don Antonio de Ulloa had her steering destroyed and ran aground. By 12:30 p.m., it was over. Every Spanish vessel was either sunk, burning, or aground. The shore batteries had been silenced. White flags appeared over the wreckage. The Battle of Manila Bay had lasted 7 hours, though the actual fighting totaled perhaps 3. The casualty figures tell the story of the complete mismatch. Spanish losses: all 7 warships destroyed. 161 killed, 210 wounded. Admiral Montoyo wounded and captured. American losses: 0 ships lost. 8 men slightly wounded, mostly from heat exhaustion in the gun turrets. 1 sailor died of a heat stroke later. The next day, Dewey cabled Washington. The squadron is in excellent health and spirits. Not a single serious injury to any vessel. The victory at Manila Bay stunned the world. European naval experts had predicted a close fight, possibly a Spanish victory given their defensive position. Instead, an American fleet had sailed 8,000 miles and destroyed an enemy fleet in a single morning without losing a ship. Overnight, George Dewey became a national hero. Songs were written about him. Babies were named after him. When he eventually returned to the United States, he was promoted to the unique rank of Admiral of the Navy, a rank created specifically for him and held by only one person in American history. Manila. He had to wait for reinforcements, and in the meantime, he found an ally, Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the Philippine independence movement. Aguinaldo had been fighting for Philippine independence even before the Americans arrived. Dewey encouraged the Filipino rebels to besiege Manila from the land while his ships blockaded from the sea. It seemed like a perfect partnership. It wouldn't last. While Dewey was winning glory in the Pacific, the main American effort was focused on Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The Spanish Caribbean Fleet, under Admiral Pascual Cervera Huaytopit, was in almost as bad shape as Montoyo's force in Manila. Cervera knew it. In April, before even leaving Spain, he wrote to his superiors, "I am absolutely certain that our squadron is heading to a disaster." But orders were orders. Cervera's fleet, consisting of 4 armored cruisers and 2 destroyers, sailed from Spain on April 29, 1898. The Americans didn't know where he was headed. Cape Verde, Puerto Rico, Havana? The U.S. Navy scrambled to find him. Cervera actually headed for Santiago de Cuba on the island's southern coast. He arrived on May 19th and immediately found himself trapped. Admiral William T. Sanson's North Atlantic Squadron established a blockade of the harbor. Cervera's ships weren't going anywhere. The American plan was now clear: land an army, capture Santiago, and force Cervera's fleet to either be captured in port or be destroyed trying to escape. The invasion force assembled at Tampa, Florida, was chaos. Over 17,000 men gathered with insufficient transport ships, no proper tropical equipment, and minimal coordination. The regular army was supplemented by volunteers, including an unusual cavalry unit that would become the most famous American military formation of the war. The 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment was organized by Leonard Wood, a military doctor, and Theodore Roosevelt, who resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to join the fighting. The unit was nicknamed the Rough Riders by the press, and it was a truly American mix: cowboys from the West, Native American scouts, Ivy League athletes, New York City policemen, prospectors, and adventurers. Roosevelt, serving as second in command with the rank of lieutenant colonel, used his own money to buy equipment for the unit. He was 39 years old, energetic, and hungry for military glory. He understood instinctively that this war could be a stepping stone to higher things. The transport situation was so bad that most of the cavalry had to leave their horses in Florida. The Rough Riders would fight on foot. On June 22, 1898, the invasion force began landing at Daiquiri and Siboney on Cuba's southeastern coast. The landing was unopposed, the Spanish having withdrawn inland. Now came the hard part, fighting through jungle and heat to reach Santiago. The first significant engagement came on June 24th at Las Guasimas, a jungle crossroads about 3 miles inland from Siboney. A combined force of about 1,000 American troops, including the Rough Riders and regular army units, advanced along 2 parallel trails toward Spanish positions. They didn't know exactly where the Spanish were or in what strength, and the thick jungle vegetation limited visibility to just a few yards in places. At 8 a.m., the lead elements ran into Spanish pickets. Suddenly, from concealed positions in the dense foliage, Spanish rifles opened fire. The Americans couldn't see their attackers, just muzzle flashes in the green tangle. Men fell wounded or dead without ever seeing who shot them. The Americans returned fire and began to advance, using cover and moving in small groups. The Rough Riders, fighting alongside the 1st and 10th Regular Cavalry Regiments, pushed forward through intense heat and gunfire. The Spanish force, numbering about 1,500 men, fought a classic delaying action. They would fire from concealed positions, inflict casualties, then fall back to another position and repeat. They were buying time for the main Spanish force to prepare defenses around Santiago. After about 3 hours of fighting, the Spanish withdrew completely, having accomplished their goal. The Americans held the field, but at a cost: 16 killed and 52 wounded. For the Rough Riders, it was their baptism of fire. Roosevelt was exhilarated, later writing that he had enjoyed the fight immensely. But for the wounded men being carried back through the jungle in the crushing heat, there was nothing enjoyable about it. The American force regrouped and continued the advance toward Santiago. Ahead of them lay a line of fortified hills that would be the key to the entire campaign. By late June, the American army had advanced to within striking distance of Santiago. The city was protected by a series of fortified ridges known as the San Juan Heights, anchored by 2 key positions: San Juan Hill itself, and to its north, a smaller rise called Kettle Hill. The Spanish had used their time well. They'd built trenches, blockhouses, barbed wire obstacles, and positioned artillery. About 500 Spanish soldiers defended San Juan Hill, with perhaps 1,200 more in the area. They had good fields of fire and were dug in deep. The American force numbered about 8,000 men divided into 2 main elements. General Henry Lawton's division would attack the village of El Caney to the north, while General Jacob Kent's division would assault the San Juan Heights directly. The cavalry division, fighting dismounted, would support Kent's attack. The battle was set for July 1, 1898. It would be the largest land engagement of the war, and it would make Theodore Roosevelt a legend. The day began badly for the Americans. At 8 a.m., American artillery began bombarding the Spanish positions, but they had too few guns, and they were largely ineffective against the fortified positions. Worse, the Americans had deployed an observation balloon to spot for the artillery. The balloon was a bright yellow gas bag floating overhead, and it marked the location of American forces as clearly as if they'd painted a target on the ground. Spanish artillery, which had held fire to preserve ammunition and hide their positions, now opened up with devastating effect. Shells crashed into the packed American columns still moving up the jungle trails. Men were blown apart. The wounded screamed. Panic began to spread. To the north, Lawton's assault on El Caney was supposed to be a quick action, 2 hours at most, before joining the main attack. But the Spanish defenders of El Caney, just 520 men under General Joaquin Vara del Rey, fought with incredible determination. They held out for nearly 10 hours, inflicting heavy casualties before finally being overwhelmed. General Vara del Rey was killed leading his men. Lawton's division would not participate in the main battle. Back at San Juan Heights by 1 p.m., the American forces were packed along a jungle trail, taking artillery fire, with no clear orders to advance. Men were dying, and they couldn't even shoot back because they couldn't see the enemy positions on the heights above them. General William Shafter, the overall American commander, was prostrate with fever and dysentery. He wasn't at the front. Orders were confused or non-existent. And then something happened that military historians still debate. Someone, likely either General Samuel Sumner or Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt, decided enough was enough. The only way to stop the artillery fire was to take those hills. At approximately 1 p.m., without explicit orders from Shafter, units began to move forward. On the American right, aimed at Kettle Hill, were the Rough Riders and the 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry Regiments. The 9th and 10th were Buffalo Soldier Regiments, African-American enlisted men led by white officers, veterans of the Indian Wars. Roosevelt was in his element. He mounted his horse, a small one named Little Texas, and he was the only mounted officer in the attack. He moved up and down the line, shouting encouragement, ordering men forward. But before the infantry could assault, Lieutenant John Henry Parker brought up 4 Gatling guns, early machine guns capable of firing 400 rounds per minute. Parker positioned them to provide covering fire. At 1:30 p.m., the Gatling guns opened fire. For 8 minutes, they poured 18,000 rounds into the Spanish positions on Kettle Hill. Sound was like ripping canvas amplified 1,000 times. Spanish defenders were forced to keep their heads down. Under this covering fire, the Rough Riders, the 9th Cavalry, and the 10th Cavalry charged up Kettle Hill. Roosevelt rode ahead on Little Texas until the terrain got too steep and he had to dismount. Men scrambled upward through tall grass, through barbed wire, under Spanish rifle fire. Roosevelt described it later. The charge itself was great fun. It was possibly the happiest moment of his life, leading men up a hill under fire, bullets snapping past, the hill growing steeper, Spanish resistance collapsing. At 2 p.m., Kettle Hill was taken. The Spanish defenders fell back towards Santiago. Roosevelt and his men stood on the crest, cheering. But the main objective, San Juan Hill itself, was still in Spanish hands. Kent's infantry division was making its assault from a different direction. The 71st New York Volunteers, 6th and 16th Infantry, and other units advanced across an open meadow toward the hill. There was no cover. Spanish rifles and artillery cut them down, but they kept coming. Men fell, others took their places. Officers led from the front and died. The line wavered, steadied, advanced again. The Gatling guns, repositioned, fired into the Spanish trenches. The infantry closed to within 100 yards, then 50. Soldiers began climbing the slope, using every bit of cover, firing, and moving. At 2:30 p.m., after brutal close-range fighting, San Juan Hill was taken. The American flag went up over the main Spanish blockhouse. Roosevelt, watching from Kettle Hill, couldn't resist. He led the Rough Riders and elements of the cavalry regiments in a charge from Kettle Hill to join the forces on San Juan Hill. It was militarily unnecessary, but made for great photographs, which were taken shortly afterward. The cost had been high. American casualties for the day: 205 killed, 1,180 wounded. It was the bloodiest single day for American forces in the entire war. Spanish casualties were roughly 215 killed and 375 wounded. But Santiago was now doomed. The Americans held the heights overlooking the city. Spanish reinforcements couldn't get through the American blockade. Admiral Cervera's fleet was still trapped in the harbor. The noose was tightening. Admiral Cervera knew his situation was hopeless. His ships were trapped in Santiago Harbor, blockaded by a superior American fleet. Spanish land forces couldn't hold the city much longer after the fall of San Juan Hill. But Captain General Ramon Blanco in Havana ordered Cervera to break out, to try to escape west along the Cuban coast toward Havana. Cervera protested. He knew his ships would be destroyed. But orders were orders. On the morning of July 3, 1898, Cervera held a final meeting with his captains. "It is impossible to escape," he told them. "But we must show that Spain still has brave men capable of dying for their country." His fleet consisted of 4 armored cruisers: the Infanta Maria Teresa, Cervera's flagship, the Vizcaya, the Cristobal Colon, and the Almirante Oquendo, plus 2 small destroyers, the Furor and Pluton. The American blockading fleet was vastly superior. The armored cruiser USS Brooklyn, the battleships USS Iowa, USS Indiana, USS Oregon, and USS Texas, plus several smaller vessels. Admiral William Sampson commanded overall, but he was away that morning on the USS New York, attending a conference. Commodore Winfield Scotch Lee commanded the ships on station. It was a Sunday morning. Many American sailors were at breakfast or attending church services. The Spanish timing was deliberate, hoping to catch the Americans off guard. At 9:15 a.m., lookouts on the USS Iowa spotted smoke rising from the harbor mouth. Within minutes, the lead Spanish ship, the Maria Teresa, emerged into the open sea at full speed. Signal flags shot up across the American fleet. Enemy ships coming out. The American ships scrambled to action. Sailors ran to battle stations. Engines were stoked to full power. Anchors were hastily raised. At 9:35 a.m., the American fleet opened fire. Cervera's plan was simple: break out at maximum speed, steam west along the coast, and hope that the faster Spanish ships could outrun their pursuers. It was a desperate plan, but it was all he had. The Maria Teresa led the way, heading west at 14 knots. Behind her came the other cruisers in line. The destroyers Furor and Pluton tried to attack the American blockade ships with torpedoes to create confusion. It didn't work. The destroyers were small, lightly armored, and outgunned. American secondary batteries tore them to pieces. Both destroyers were sinking within 15 minutes. The Pluton exploded, probably when a shell hit her magazines. The Furor was shot to pieces and sank. Few crew members survived. Now came the cruiser duel. The American ships, faster and more numerous, began to parallel the Spanish line, firing broadside after broadside. The range was close, often less than 2,000 yards. Shell splashes churned the water. Smoke from guns and fires drifted across the sea. The Maria Teresa, Cervera's flagship, drew concentrated fire from the USS Brooklyn and USS Iowa. Within 20 minutes, she was hit repeatedly. Fires broke out across her superstructure. Her steering was damaged. Cervera, realizing she was doomed, ordered her run aground to save his crew. At 10:15 a.m., the Maria Teresa was beached 6 miles west of Santiago, burning furiously. The Almirante Oquendo followed close behind. She traded fire with the USS Iowa and USS Oregon, but was hopelessly outmatched. Shells punched through her hull, starting fires in her coal bunkers and ammunition stores. At 10:30 a.m., wreathed in flames and with her crew abandoning ship, she too was run aground. The Vizcaya lasted longer. She was faster and better armored than her sisters. For over an hour, she raced westward with the Brooklyn and Oregon in pursuit. The ships traded fire at close range, shell splashes towering over the decks. But gradually, American gunnery told. Hits accumulated. Fires spread. At 11:15 a.m., with her hull riddled and men dying in the flames, the Vizcaya's captain ordered her beached. That left only the Cristobal Colon, the newest and fastest of the Spanish cruisers. She had a theoretical speed advantage and might have escaped if not for one crucial problem. She'd never received her main battery guns. The heavy turrets were empty, meaning she could barely fight back. The Colon ran west at her maximum speed of 15.5 knots. The Brooklyn and the Oregon gave chase. For over an hour, it was a pure speed contest. The American ships, slightly faster, slowly closed the distance. But the Colon had a secret handicap. She was running low on good coal. She'd been burning inferior coal for weeks, which reduced her top speed. By 1 p.m., 50 miles west of Santiago, her engines were laboring. The American ships were closing in. The USS Oregon, which had the longest-range guns, opened fire at extreme range. Her 13-inch shells began to land close. One plunged into the water just ahead of the Colon, throwing up a massive spray. At 1:15 p.m., Captain Jose de Paredes of the Colon struck his colors and ran his ship aground. The battle was over. American casualties: 1 man killed, 1 wounded. The one fatality was a sailor killed by a premature explosion in one of the American ship's guns. Spanish casualties: 323 killed, 151 wounded. About 1,800 captured, including Admiral Cervera. All 6 Spanish ships were destroyed. The American fleet was intact. In less than 4 hours, the Spanish Atlantic Fleet had ceased to exist. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. With the destruction of Cervera's fleet, Spanish resistance in Cuba collapsed rapidly. Santiago surrendered on July 17th after a brief siege. The Spanish garrison was allowed to evacuate with military honors. But American forces weren't done. On July 25th, General Nelson Miles landed at Guanica, Puerto Rico, with 3,300 troops. The Spanish garrison there, knowing the war was lost, offered only token resistance. Puerto Ricans largely welcomed the Americans, hoping for better treatment than they'd received under Spanish colonial rule. The campaign was almost bloodless. 3 Americans killed, about 40 wounded. Back in the Philippines, the situation was more complex. After Dewey's naval victory in May, American ground troops didn't arrive until late July. In the meantime, Filipino revolutionary forces under Emilio Aguinaldo had surrounded Manila, cutting it off from the interior. When American troops finally arrived, Dewey and General Wesley Merritt negotiated a strange arrangement with the Spanish. There would be a mock battle. The Spanish would fire for the sake of honor, then surrender to the Americans, not to the Filipinos. The Spanish preferred to hand the city over to a fellow Western power rather than to the native revolutionaries. On August 13, 1898, this bizarre charade played out. There was some artillery fire, a few casualties, and then the Spanish surrendered Manila to American forces. Filipino troops were forbidden from entering the city. They'd fought for months to liberate their capital, only to see it handed to a new colonial master. Aguinaldo was furious, but he couldn't do anything about it. Not yet. Within a year, the Filipinos would be at war with the United States in a brutal conflict that would make the Spanish-American War look like a picnic. On August 12, 1898, Spain and the United States signed an armistice. The fighting was over after just 113 days. Peace negotiations began in Paris in October 1898. The American delegation was led by William R. Day, the Secretary of State, and included several senators. The Spanish delegation was desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of their empire. The terms were harsh but predictable. Spain would grant Cuba independence, though Cuba would effectively become an American protectorate under what became known as the Platt Amendment. Spain would cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States outright. And here's where it got controversial. Spain would sell the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. That last provision sparked fierce debate in the United States. Anti-imperialists, led by figures like Mark Twain and industrialist Andrew Carnegie, argued that America had no business ruling overseas colonies. The whole point of the war, they noted, was to liberate Cuba from colonial oppression. How could America then turn around and colonize the Philippines? Pro-imperialists, including Theodore Roosevelt and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, argued that America had a duty to civilize the Filipinos and that the Philippines represented a valuable strategic and commercial position in Asia. The Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris by a narrow margin on February 6, 1899. The United States was now an imperial power, whether it liked it or not. The human cost of the war was relatively light by the standards of later conflicts. American casualties: approximately 385 killed in action. But about 2,061 died from disease, yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. Disease killed 5 times more Americans than Spanish bullets. Spanish casualties: roughly 2,000 killed in action, thousands more dead from disease. Cuban civilian deaths: difficult to calculate, but estimates suggest between 200,000 and 400,000 died during the war and the preceding years of reconcentration. For Theodore Roosevelt, the war was the making of his political career. When he returned from Cuba in August 1898, he was a national hero. Newspapers couldn't get enough of the Rough Rider colonel who had charged up San Juan Hill, the bespectacled aristocrat who had proven himself in battle. Thomas Platt, the Republican boss of New York, saw an opportunity. He recruited Roosevelt to run for governor of New York in the 1898 election. Roosevelt campaigned explicitly on his war record, and he won by a narrow margin, just 1% of the vote. As governor, Roosevelt proved to be a progressive reformer, taking on corrupt political machines and big corporations. He was popular with voters, but increasingly troublesome to the Republican establishment. In 1899, Vice President Garrett Hobart died, leaving an open spot on President McKinley's ticket for the 1900 election. Republican bosses, eager to remove the troublesome Roosevelt from New York, pushed him for the vice presidency. Roosevelt didn't want the job. He thought the vice presidency was a political dead end, but the media and public pressure were overwhelming. Roosevelt campaigned energetically for McKinley and undoubtedly contributed to McKinley's landslide re-election in November 1900. 6 months later, on September 6, 1901, President McKinley was shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. McKinley lingered for 8 days before dying on September 14th. Theodore Roosevelt, at age 42, became the youngest president in American history. Think about the trajectory. In 1898, Roosevelt was an assistant secretary of the Navy, an important position, but hardly a household name. By 1901, he was President of the United States. The war had been the catalyst. As president, Roosevelt would pursue aggressive antitrust policies, breaking up monopolies like the Northern Securities Company. He would mediate the end of the Russo-Japanese War, earning the Nobel Peace Prize. He would launch the construction of the Panama Canal, perhaps the greatest engineering project of the age. He would create the National Park System, preserving millions of acres of wilderness. Without the Spanish-American War, without San Juan Hill, none of that happens. Someone else would have been McKinley's vice president in 1900. Someone else would have become president in 1901, and American history would have taken a very different path. For Spain, the war was a catastrophe so profound that they called it simply El Disaster, the disaster. In a matter of months, Spain had lost the last remnants of its once great empire. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam were all gone. The empire that had once stretched from Mexico to Argentina, from the Philippines to the Caribbean, was reduced to a few holdings in North Africa. The psychological impact was immense. A generation of Spanish intellectuals, writers, and artists, known as the Generation of '98, emerged, grappling with questions of Spanish identity and purpose. Writers like Miguel de Unamuno, Pío Baroja, and Antonio Machado asked, what did it mean to be Spanish in this new world? How had Spain fallen so far? The political consequences were equally severe. The corrupt system of alternating liberal and conservative governments began to break down. Political violence increased. Military officers, feeling that civilian politicians had betrayed them during the war, became increasingly radicalized. In the 1920s, General Miguel Primo de Rivera would establish a military dictatorship with the king's blessing. When that dictatorship failed, the monarchy itself would be overthrown in 1931. The Second Spanish Republic that followed would be torn by political extremism from both left and right. In 1936, all these tensions would explode into the Spanish Civil War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. While it's too simplistic to draw a straight line from 1898 to 1936, the disaster of 1898 was undeniably one of the catalysts that destabilized Spanish politics for decades. The Spanish-American War marked America's emergence as a global imperial power. The United States now possessed territories spanning the Pacific and the Caribbean. American soldiers, ships, and commerce would operate worldwide. But empire came with a price. In the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo and his forces, feeling betrayed by the Americans, launched an insurgency in 1899. The Philippine-American War would last until 1902, officially, though fighting continued in some areas until 1913. It was a brutal guerrilla conflict. American forces employed many of the same tactics the Spanish had used in Cuba, including concentration camps. Filipino fighters used ambushes, terrorism, and guerrilla warfare. By the time it ended, approximately 4,200 American soldiers were dead, along with an estimated 20,000 Filipino fighters and between 200,000 and 1 million Filipino civilians, most from disease and starvation. The anti-imperialist movement in America, led by figures like Mark Twain, pointed to the Philippines as proof that empire corrupted American values. Twain acidically suggested a new American flag, with the white stripes painted black and the stars replaced by the skull and crossbones. In Cuba, independence was more illusion than reality. The Platt Amendment, forced into the Cuban Constitution as a condition of American withdrawal, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and to maintain a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which remains American territory to this day. Puerto Rico became an American territory. Its people eventually granted citizenship in 1917, but never statehood. The island's political status remains unresolved over a century later. The war established patterns that would define American foreign policy for the next century. Intervention in Latin America, competition with European powers for global influence, and the tension between anti-colonial ideals and imperial ambitions. So what can we learn from the Spanish-American War of 1898? First, the power of media to shape public opinion and drive policy. The yellow journalism of Hearst and Pulitzer didn't single-handedly cause the war, but it created an environment where war became almost inevitable. The Maine explosion might have been an accident, but the newspapers ensured it would be treated as an act of war. In our own era of social media and 24-hour news cycles, that lesson remains relevant. Second, the importance of military preparedness and technological advantage. The United States won the war so decisively not because of superior courage or tactics, although American forces fought bravely, but because of superior equipment. Modern steel battleships defeated old wooden cruisers. Rifled guns outranged smoothbore cannons. Spain was trying to fight a 20th century war with a 19th century military. Third, the often enormous gap between stated intentions and actual outcomes. The United States went to war officially to liberate Cuba from Spanish oppression. But the war resulted in American occupation of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and effective control over Cuba. The liberator became the new colonial master. Whether you view that as realpolitik or hypocrisy depends on your perspective, but the irony is undeniable. Fourth, the role of individual leadership in crisis. Theodore Roosevelt's impact on the war and American history more broadly can't be overstated. His aggressive push for war while Assistant Secretary of the Navy his dramatic military service, and his subsequent political career all shaped the next 2 decades of American history. And it almost didn't happen. Roosevelt came within a percentage point of losing the 1898 New York governor's race. History often turns on very small margins. Finally, the war reminds us that military victory in war doesn't automatically translate to political success in peace. The United States won every battle and achieved all its military objectives, but the subsequent occupation of the Philippines led to a brutal insurgency. Cuba remained unstable for decades. Puerto Rico's status remained unresolved. Spain collapsed into decades of political chaos. Military victory is often just the beginning of the complications, not the end. The Spanish-American War was called a splendid little war by John Hay, who would become Roosevelt's Secretary of State. And from a narrow military perspective, it was short, victorious, relatively cheap in American lives. But the consequences, both for the United States and for the millions of people who now lived under American control or influence, were anything but little. This war marked America's transition from a continental power to a global empire. It shaped American foreign policy for the next century. It produced one of America's most influential presidents, and it destroyed the last remnants of the Spanish Empire, with consequences that echoed through Spanish politics for decades. 113 days of war, 7 hours at Manila Bay, an afternoon at San Juan Hill, a Sunday morning chase off Santiago. These battles changed the world. Understanding the Spanish-American War helps us understand America's role in the world today. The debates about intervention versus isolationism, about America's responsibilities as a global power, about the gap between our stated ideals and our actions, all of these began in earnest in 1898. We're still having those debates. If this deep dive into military history interests you, there's so much more to explore. The Siege of Santiago, the yellow fever epidemics that ravaged both armies, the incredible story of the USS Oregon's 14,000-mile voyage around South America to join the war, the role of African American soldiers in the Buffalo Soldier regiments, the stories of individual sailors and soldiers. Each battle has layers of detail and human drama we couldn't cover in one video. I encourage you to read more. Some excellent starting points: David Traxell's 1898, The Birth of the American Century, Ivan Musican's Empire by Default, and For the Philippine War. Brian McAllister Lynn's The Philippine War, 1899 to 1902. If you found this video valuable, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel grow. Subscribe if you want more in-depth military history content. And drop a comment with your thoughts. Do you think American intervention in Cuba was justified? Could the war have been avoided? How do you view America's imperial period? I read every comment and often get ideas for future videos from your suggestions. Share this video with anyone interested in military history, American history, or the origins of the modern geopolitical order. This war doesn't get the attention it deserves, but it shaped the world we live in today. Until next time, thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding why it happened and what it means for us today.